I'm Rachael Newham and I'm the author of Learning to Breathe and the Mental Health Resident Church Project Manager at SPCK.
And I am Katharine Roberts, or Welby Roberts, I suppose. And I'm the author of I Thought There Would Be Cake.
Which always makes me think of cake, and then I want cake.
Yeah, it doesn't make me think of cake.
Oh, maybe you read the word so many times that it lost all meaning.
Yeah, or maybe I just didn't eat much cake when I was writing it.
Maybe that was the problem.
I thought there would be cake and there wasn't, so I've given up on the association.
That's a fair point. Yeah. So we both wrote books around faith and mental health, I guess. And it's weird, isn't it? Because it's such a, well, okay, it's not a common topic, but it's a way more common topic than it was certainly when your book came out in 2016?
17, I think.
17, and then mine in 18. But I feel like every year the conversation kind of changes. It's not even that we've got further along. Well, we have got further along in the conversation about faith and mental health, but we certainly haven't reached a point where we need to stop talking about it.
No, and I mean, I think we never will. I think it's an interesting one. My kind of experience with it is that it's become quite acceptable to talk about. And people are more understanding if you do talk about it in a personal context, and you're more likely to get support perhaps than you would have. But I think there's still, we're still a very long way from there being a sort of a response, like an engagement on a sort of organizational level, or you know, where actually it's not just that it's okay if you come in and say I'm depressed, but that maybe people would notice signs, or maybe, you know, it would be common to hear it talked about from the front without it being on a special mental health service thing.
Yeah.
So I think it's an interesting thing, because I think progressing it to the point where it's not just about it's all right for you to have mental health problems, but understanding that we all have mental health that needs to be cared for, and therefore we need to frame the way we do church, the way we do community, the way we engage with each other around that context, and it be as present as it, you know, as anything else in terms of how we love each other and live together. I think we've got quite a long way to go on that.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. And I think as well, we have got better at talking about mental health and kind of the most common mental illnesses. So if you talk about having depression or anxiety, and people kind of get it maybe a bit more, but actually when it comes to things like bipolar disorder or psychosis, there's still a lot of stigma and misunderstanding around that, I think. And it's almost like until we can get an understanding of the spectrum, I guess, of mental health, from amazing mental health, kind of, you know, what we'll have in heaven kind of mental health and what was in Eden, to severe life-limiting and sometimes life-ending mental illness, and understand that we're all on that spectrum, and actually it's not just some people will end up on one end of the spectrum. It can affect anyone. I guess that's where there'll be the parity of esteem that is talked about a lot, which I think we're a really long way from.
Yeah, I mean, parity of esteem is a funny one, because it you know, people are really willing to talk about it, but actually, yeah, the early investment, we could save so many lives with more sort of early intervention, early recognition, early engagement, and if we have an understanding of all of us being on, you know, all of us having mental health, and it, you know, everyone knows that we all have mental health, but there's something where they're like, yeah, but mine's good, and that's the box I'm in, and that's the box I'm going to be in, and, you know, I do get stressed, or I do, but, you know, you hear stories and you come across people whose mental health has been fine, and then suddenly they've got, you know, some very, very serious mental health conditions, and then the stigma that they face for that is huge. And yeah, I don't know how you kind of progress people. I guess it is just continuing to talk about it. But those more severe conditions, or the more life-limiting conditions, are still very, very stigmatized against. I've got a friend who literally lost friends overnight, good friends, close friends, and who isn't trusted to babysit. And, you know, she's an incredible mum, an incredible friend. And you're like, well, nothing's changed in who she is.
Yeah.
It's just that now there's a label that people are scared of.
Yeah. And I think there's this, I think a lot of it does come down to this idea that, you know, when we become Christians, something gets changed instantly. And that kind of, I guess the culture that probably you and I grew up in was that kind of, you know, we're going to be history makers. You go to a festival, you become a Christian, and your life does a 180. But actually, there's stories in the middle all the time of actually, yeah, I became a Christian, but I still have a mental illness, but I found God in it, rather than God took me away from it.
Like, I don't know anyone who really did become a Christian and then everything was great.
No.
I've met a lot of people who have almost acted like that. And I think that there is the life-changing thing of the sense of security in faith and things like that can have does have a huge effect on people's lives and does change the direction of people's lives. But I remember there was a testimony I heard, which I think I might have mentioned it in my book actually, but I heard the same guy give a testimony 2 years apart. And the first time I heard it, he ended the testimony and everything was great. And he'd been through hell. I mean, like the most extraordinary testimony. And 2 years later, he had a new ending because he could include the stuff that was better that he had been struggling with 2 years ago. And so then you have this situation where actually you kind of feel lied to, because becoming a Christian, walking with God, being in that place means that you've got companionship in the darkest times, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't acknowledge the darkest times. And I mean, it's why I'm so excited about your book, the new book, the Lament book, because actually Lament is something that we should be doing together collectively. And I mean, especially now, obviously there's so much.
How much to lament, isn't there?
There's an enormous amount, and we need to be doing that as a collective and telling testimonies of extraordinary goodness that has happened in our lives when we're still living in a really dark and difficult place, and celebrating that God does extraordinary things. And I think we need to change the narrative when it comes to talking about our mental health and talking about how we engage with it, so that we're not trying to look for hope in the immediate, but we're engaging with people in their pain.
Yeah, and I think there's this, it's like in Job, isn't it? It's sort of, we can tend to think of the story of Job being like, oh, everything was bad and then God fixed it all. But ultimately, God didn't, Job didn't get back the wives and children he'd lost. Yes, he
stopped mourning them.
Yeah, exactly. It is, but it's that ability to hold those two things together. And I think we live increasingly so in a world where everything needs to be black and white. People are either heroes or villains. Life's either good or bad. But actually, the reality is nothing's that simple. No one is 100% good. No one is 100% bad. And the periods that we might call the worst periods of our lives, that doesn't mean that nothing good happened in them, or we didn't see God moving, but it doesn't make them good. It is that there is this space in between that we have to learn to live in, because actually that's the place we live in all the time. It's ordinary time, isn't it, in the kind of the church year? Yeah.
And I mean, I think Job is one of my favorite stories in the Bible for how the church can adjust how it walks with people in those dark times. Because one of my favorite things about it is his friends come and they sit and they weep with him and they mourn with him, and that is great. It's a really good thing and to be celebrated. And then they start to speak. And that's the problem.
Where all the problems begin in life in general.
Do the mourning, do the journey, and they start to speak and they start to say, well, what did you do? And maybe, you know, you're not being holy enough, maybe you're not praying enough, maybe you sinned, like, and actually it's such a common thing for people to experience when they're going through really difficult periods, when they're struggling with a mental health problem, that people will say these sorts of things. You know, you need to have faith, you need to trust in the joy of the Lord, you need to trust that God loves you, and you know that he made you in his image, and you're perfectly and wonderfully made. And it's like, well, that's great, but God was so offended by Job's response in doing that, in speaking, that he wouldn't be right with them without Job praying for them. He told Job to go and intervene for his friends so that they could get right with God. Because actually what they did, the mourning, the sitting with him, the weeping, that God was on board with. The speaking, the telling him, the blaming him for all of this that had happened, God was not on board with. And we've got it in black and white. It's in the Bible. It's right there for us to learn from. And yet we still make the same mistake that Job's friends make. And that's because we're uncomfortable in that darkness, and we want to find a solution. We want to explain why it probably won't happen to us. And so we come up with these reasons why it's happened to someone else, and instead we should be going, this could be any of us. Let's love each other, let's journey with each other, and let's weep and mourn and celebrate together as a collective without feeling the need to fix and blame.
But it has to be a job for the whole church. I think so often we leave it to, you know, the clergy or the paid staff members because it's their job, and they don't have capacity.
It's an impossible job. And I was having a conversation with someone about this the other day, actually. Like, it's very easy to say, my church hasn't done this, my church hasn't done this, my church hasn't done this. But when you're saying that, oftentimes people mean my church leadership hasn't done this. And actually, it's the whole collective church that hasn't, you know, in terms of, but also people have been going through, and it's an interesting thing, like there has been relationships that have fallen that I have not engaged with in the last year because I haven't had capacity, but then I felt very rejected by other relationships I would have liked to engage in, but they haven't had the capacity. And we sort of have to find a way now, as we engage with mental health, as we think about coming out of this impossible time, we have to work out a way of how we catch up, and we think bigger than. It's very easy to center yourself in the world because yours is the perspective that you know best.
Yeah, of course.
And to forget that everyone else is centered in the world for themselves.
Yeah.
And that is how we all operate. And so we have to sort of see how we're feeling, go, well, to be honest, if I'm feeling rejected by a huge number of people, probably everyone is feeling rejected by a huge number of people because there's only so much capacity you have to engage with everybody and to catch up with everybody when you're not allowed to see them. And, you know, life is so much and you're dealing with everything. And so, again, it's about that collective responsibility. And I think as we come out of lockdown, it's going to be a really important thing not to say my church has failed me and blame leadership when actually we need, you know, it's shown a failing in many ways for how we engage with each other as a community and how we carry each other as a community, because it shouldn't all be on the leader's responsibility to make a cohesive community.
And I think we have to be gentle with one another. Everyone is bruised. Everyone, you know, so many people feel like they've had a layer of skin removed, and so that those slightest, you know, everyone gets more annoyed with each other because they're tired. And church leaders have had, you know, a hellish year in many ways. And so I think as we come together, whether you know have a mental illness or not, we have to be ruled by gentleness and ruled by, you know, assume everyone's doing their best, and then actually we are able to be a lot kinder to one another.
Yes. And I assume everyone is feeling, you know, a lot of what you're feeling, maybe in a different context, and, you know, maybe in a different way, but actually everyone is feeling raw. It's to the point where apparently 10% of us have actually thrived in lockdown. Because they've had better relationships with their families and more time at home and things like that. But then I was talking to someone the other day who was saying that he's spoken to people who have had that, but now they're feeling really guilty because they've kind of enjoyed it, but so many other people have suffered. And so, you know, even if you've had a good year, there is this added emotional burden to that goodness. And I think that actually understanding that we're all carrying
something
trauma that has been inflicted on the world's population, and it's going to have a huge impact on our collective mental health, our individual mental health, and we need to look at it from the perspective of, if I'm feeling this raw, then I assume others are feeling this raw too. And so actually giving each other the benefit of the doubt, assuming the best, and going from there, engaging in relationship and reaching out for community if you have the capacity to do so, even to those who maybe aren't reaching out to you, because maybe they're the ones that really desperately need it. You know, we could actually come out of this awful time with a healthier approach to mental health as a community, as a church and as a wider society than we had going in. But it does require that gentleness and that forgiveness and that sort of like larger thinking than out of your own perspective.
And I think you know, when you're going through something difficult, you do become more insular because your energy, it takes so much energy to do your own life that actually that's what falls off. And I think you're right in that if everyone does their bit, you know, if everyone reaches out to one person, there is power in that. There's power in, you know, if we all pray for one person, that's one person more than not, if that makes sense. I think we can be so critical of the big picture stuff when actually we've got to do the little picture stuff, but do it gently with one another and ourselves. And
actually, bit by bit, you know, and it does come down to those individual actions. That's what will change things. That's what will make a softer, kinder, gentler world. And I think waiting for someone else to act, you know, leads to a fear around it, and it becomes a bigger deal than it needs to be. But I mean, again, it is remembering, like, there's nothing wrong with having become more insular in lockdown. Like, I have felt guilty for not reaching out to more people, but actually I have never been this ill in my life. Like, and so you've got to have that understanding for your position where you've been at, and there's nothing wrong with looking after yourself, and self-care is an essential part. You know, if you burn out looking after other people, then you've done, you know, you then stop being able to look after other people, and you no longer are able to look after yourself. So, you know, you have to get it all in balance. And actually that is the reason for the collective responsibility, because if we all take on a little,
it's not so overwhelming,
and you get a lot done.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah.
So we've worked out how to change everything, and what needs to be doing. Now we've
established that we don't have to do it ourselves, so everyone can go and do it, and we can go to bed.
Is that not what we said? Yeah.
Something like that.